Good afternoon, AP World History students. I am going to very quickly go through USA and Canada, and in a second screencast talk about Latin America. We already talked about some of this stuff from yesterday and the Mexican-American War. As I mentioned before, I've changed the PowerPoint just a tiny bit on this, but please read your textbook about that. We also talked about the conflicts that the American Indians and the U.S. military engaged in during the 19th century. And you'll study those a great deal more in American history. I think they're really important, and I look forward to learning more about those. If you'd like to watch that video, I will connect the video clip onto my Moodle page and you can watch it there. I think there are some important causes of the Civil War, however, to talk about here at this point. The North and the South were very different. They lived very different lives, they had different traditions, and of course they had different weather. But probably the most important difference between the North and the South was industry versus tradition. Even here in Minnesota, we had flour mills. We were beginning to develop an industry, a food processing industry. In the northeast of the United States, factories were developing, and the raw materials, the cotton that was coming from the south, would do a great deal, or would provide a great deal of economic growth for the northeastern states. Politically, there was a lot of conflict between federal versus states' rights, with the southern states believing very much in what they thought should be independent states' rights with very minimal federal control. This is a problem, of course, that we still debate to this day. And of course, socially, slavery versus freedom would be an important cause of the Civil War. The northern states, being non-slave states, still benefited economically from the slavery of the South, but ideologically, slavery had come to be seen as a very unjust and inhumane institution for many people in the North, whereas many people in the South viewed it as a way of life, and in fact believed that they were being benevolent slaveholders. And indeed, there were some that were perhaps more accommodating to slaves than some slave owners than others, but for most, the institution was very brutal and unkind. The trigger would be new states and slavery. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 tried to make it so that when a new state entered the Union, that the slaveholding states would have an equal number of votes in Congress. But eventually, this became very difficult to uphold, as most of the new states who were entering the Union did not want to have slavery as an institution that was legal in their state. Abraham Lincoln comes on the scene, and he was very strongly anti-slavery. You can see the quote that I put under his picture here. So Lincoln is elected president. 11 states immediately secede from the Union, knowing that he will make it part of his goal of his administration to have slavery abolished in those states. Now, he does it at the outset of the war in 1861. This does not appear to be a primary goal of the war. The primary goal of the war appears to keep the Union together. However, Lincoln would all along express the idea that slavery needed to be abolished, and in January 1st of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation freed all slaves from states that were in rebellion. There were a few border states, and you'll learn about those in American history, that this did not apply to. But at this time, the emancipation of the slaves becomes a very important goal of the war. The North is going to win. The war ends in 1865. This shows a clear triumph of the national government over the states' rights, especially the Confederate States of the South. The era of recovery is filled with challenges, and these again are things that you'll learn more about in your American history classes. Lincoln was assassinated, and the recovery dreams that he had were not fulfilled, many of them. And for me, I often think about what would have happened if Lincoln had not been assassinated. Under his leadership, would we have avoided some of the problems that we ended up having? Well, now we're going to move on to Canada, and there is a reason I have elevators here. It's not that you really need to know about the history of elevators, but this is just kind of a little known fact. Elevators, Otis, came from Canada. Fensom. If you look on that picture there, Otis Fensom, right here. Okay, he was my husband's great-grandfather. He was an inventor, and he invented the elevator originally for use in freight. It was the elevators, however, that would allow for the building of skyscrapers and would save you many, many, many steps going up flights of stairs in your future. So the next time that you go up an elevator, think about the fact that Mr. Mather's great-grandfather was the inventor of the elevator. He sold the rights to Otis, but he indeed was the inventor. And in fact, we used to get elevator money every year. All of his grandchildren would get about $1,000 a year from the sale of the Fensom Elevator Company to Otis. But sadly, the elevator money is gone. We should have put it in an education account, but oh well, hindsight's 2020. So I have a great connection with Canada. I love Canadians. My husband's whole family's Canadian. My in-laws are Canadian. My nieces and nephews are Canadian, and aunts and uncles. So I love Canada. Canada in the east, we have both the French, who are primarily Catholic, and the British, who are Anglican and Protestant, living in eastern Canada, and distributed in communities across southern Canada. But they differ both in their religious practices and in the style of governance. However, French Quebec was taken over by the Brits after the 7 Years' War. As you can recall, was the time when British hegemony was won, and Britain became a world power. The War of 1812 would temporarily unite the French and the British together against the external threat, which would be us, the U.S., trying to move into Canada. 1840 to 1867, the British authorities granted home rule to Canadian provinces to avoid rebellion. They did not want the style of rebellion that the United States had instituted against Britain, and so by granting home rule, they hoped to avoid the conflict that the U.S. ended up having with Great Britain. Now, this worked out pretty well, and in fact, would eventually end up leading to independence completely without war. The British North America Act of 1867 put together the 5 provinces, and there are more provinces than that now, but at that time 5 provinces came together to form what's called the Dominion of Canada. In the Dominion of Canada, there are minority people groups that are recognized. There are the First Nations people, who are the indigenous people, the Inuit, also indigenous people from the far north, and the Metis, who are French and indigenous mixed-race people. Now, each of these groups of people have some benefits to their membership in that category of minority. However, I have to say, as one who has spent a great deal of time in Canada, as well as my children who have worked in Canada, there is still a lot of prejudicial and discriminatory practices against especially the First Nations people, and there is certainly conflict there between them and the European majority. Canada has provincial and federal governments, with the Governor General being the British representative, and the Dominion controlled all the domestic affairs. The British retain control of all foreign affairs until 1931. In 1931, Britain becomes a commonwealth. That means it has free trade with Canada, but it is now, it has free trade with Britain, but it is now a completely independent country. Prime Minister MacDonald purchased the Western Territories of Canada and built the Trans-Canada Railway, which is very similar to the Trans-Siberian Railway, connecting the west and the east coast. So that's a picture, by the way, of my husband's uncle, Uncle Peter. Uncle Peter worked as a pilot for the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was actually a young boy in Shanghai when Shanghai was attacked by the Japanese, and he spent about 3 years in a prison camp under the control of the Japanese, where several British, he was British at the time, were interned. His story is told in the movie Empire of the Sun. But the story that is portrayed in that movie, Empire of the Sun, is really a boy's imagination, and the camp was much more grim, and the realities of it were much more depressing and dark than that movie might portray. But nevertheless, he was inspired to become a pilot for the Royal Canadian Air Force when the American pilots came into China, into Shanghai, and liberated his camp from the Japanese control. At any rate, that's my spiel about Canada. Important to remember, it is a Commonwealth of Britain. In other words, it is an independent country. However, it maintains ties with the British that allow for free trade between Britain and Canada. Thanks for your time. Keep posted for Latin America.